Welcome to Rewired Sober, the podcast that breaks down the real reasons women turn to alcohol. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a character flaw. It was your neurobiology, your conditioning, and the systems that taught women to silence themselves instead of support themselves. I'm your host, Kate Vitella. I've been a registered nurse for well over 2 decades, trained in addiction and mental health, a bit neuroscience obsessed, but spiritually grounded. This is the science and soul work of a woman's recovery, where I help you understand what's happening in your sober brain and reconnect to that deeper inner truth you've always had, that soul level knowing, the intuition the patriarchy has tried to train out of you. When women combine the science of the brain rewiring with that inner knowing, you stop feeling broken and you start feeling powerful. So let's get into it. Welcome back to Rewired Sober. This is a solo episode, yours truly. Another Kate rant on why sobriety is a feminist issue. So today we are going there. And not in the cute hashtag way, not in the girl boss, pour yourself a mocktail way, but more in the deep historical, psychological, spiritual, downright cellular way. It's our culture and conditioning and the history that was handed to us, and it has become a deeply embedded feminist issue. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with an obvious reason that is still relevant today. And many of you have heard this being discussed in women's circles, not just recovery circles, but women drink to numb the load they were never meant to carry. Women are drinking to numb the trifecta of being an employee, a mom, a peacekeeper, a therapist, a caregiver, even a stay-at-home mom. They are the maid, the dog walker, house cleaner, the shuttle bus driver. It's like women are the human version of a Swiss Army knife. So yes, we do discuss drinking for women as a way to escape this, as their 5 minutes of quiet time, as a reward for the labor load that they're carrying. And that has not changed from the 1920s until now, regardless of the fact of women working outside of the home or not. And another obvious reason that, we talk about it in recovery circles is obvious, like the woman's empowerment, right? But what comes up here is when a woman quits drinking, she is then able to learn to set boundaries. And boundaries are a huge reason why sobriety is a feminist issue. Even the most progressive man out there, let's face it, is not going to be super thrilled about a wife or partner setting a boundary, when before he benefited from us not having any boundaries. My husband is a Hispanic man. He knows what it's like to be marginalized. He was in the military for a long time. He understands women's rights and equality. But I can tell you, there was some benefits on his end to me being drunk, numb, and stupid, to me not paying attention to the finances, to me not remembering the night as it actually went. I mean, he's human. And there were some benefits to him of me being numbed out. Now, he much prefers the sober version of me, but I can tell you that it's hard for people when you start setting boundaries. It's hard for anybody in your life, not just a partner. Other reasons why is women in freedom. Once I got sober, I was able to book any girl's trip I wanted, knowing that me and my friends are going to be sober. We can trust ourselves. That became a feminist issue. Like, yes, I can plan a trip. I can plan a vacation. I can get on a plane without my husband's permission because I don't need his permission, because there's nothing that I'm going to do that is going to be, you know, egregious for our marriage. So when I got sober, I saw a lot of boundary setting. I saw a lot of freedom. I saw, myself speaking up for, the areas that I wasn't thrilled about our marriage. I mean, very obvious reasons why it was a feminist issue. That and, I hear women say they're not as sexually promiscuous when they're sober, right? It's much more beneficial to a man in our life when we're a little bit loosey-goosey. So those are obvious reasons. Also, as we've all talked about in many recovery circles, we were literally, as women, marketed to that alcohol was empowerment. Wine became a reward. It still is. I hear women all the time telling me, I deserve this reward at the end of the day. This is my time. Rosé all day became like a personality. And a woman who drank a shitload of vodka became like, I'm the fun one, right? And in a sense, big alcohol preyed on women's burnout, and they called it liberation. You know, in Holly Whitaker's book, Quit Like a Woman, she compares big alcohol to really following the playbook of big tobacco in marketing that we were lighting a torch of freedom. It was a woman's liberation. They used essentially the same playbook to market to women that, this is our, reward and we deserve this. And so good on them, but we've pink washed drinking and we even market drinking, as sponsored by breast cancer awareness. And so yes, there's these obvious things that we cannot deny. But I also want to bring in some not so obvious reasons. And that is, the deep ways the women's bodies metabolize alcohol differently. We get sicker faster. Women are higher in fat content, lower in water content than men. We get drunk faster. We lack alcohol dehydrogenase, the enzyme that helps us break down alcohol. We don't have as much as men. We experience dependence differently. And then you add in midlife and the hormone. I mean, don't get me started, right? Like, we know there is a cyclic phase to midlife hormones and estrogen, dopamine, and cortisol being the perfect storm. So yes, those obvious reasons that I've just talked about are real, and they were true, a millennia ago, and they're still true today. So, we are waking up to the fact that sobriety is a feminist issue. But I want to get into a not so obvious reason, and maybe obvious for some. It depends on how much research you've done. But this part gets a little bit controversial and a little bit spicy. And I'm just going to freaking riff and go for it here. Many of us have talked about the fact that women's voices were left out of AA. And we cannot deny that AA is the most trusted recovery model in history. It is the most ubiquitous. It is in every country, in every language. It is taught by recovery centers. The model of 12-step recovery is used in hospitals. Physicians, nurse practitioners, therapists in training are sent to AA meetings to understand addiction recovery. It is the most prevalent form of recovery in our world today. So we cannot deny the power of AA. And we cannot deny the power of the fact that AA was written for men by men. Now, that is not my opinion. That is a fact, right? It was centered on men's experiences, men's language, men's shortcomings, failures. But essentially, it was centered on a man's psychology, the reasons why a man was struggling. In the 30s, especially when the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous came to fruition, we were in this sort of early Mad Men era. Some of it's still relevant today with our current political scene. Yay, oligarchy bros. But, men were regarded as sort of know-it-alls, kind of egotistical, godlike, all-powerful. And so for a man's psychology and a man's conditioning, this was medicine. This was the most helpful messaging to get humble and to get right-sized, right? Getting humble was somewhat of what men needed in this time to get sober. And I'm not saying that women don't need humility. We do, but in a different sense. And when this all was constructed, women weren't in the room. Women weren't considered. Women couldn't be in the room. There is a chapter in the big book called Two Wives because women weren't alcoholics. Were the wives of alcoholics. Now, I am not going to go into arguing the semantics of AA. I mean, I had a friend who told me, we don't give enough exposure to Marty Mann, the first woman in Alcoholics Anonymous, and how she was a fierce advocate for recovery, and she was very powerful, and she spoke up, and she was very inspirational. And my point exactly is that nobody knows who Marty Mann is. Unless you are deep into AA culture, you don't know who that woman is because she is not a public figure. She is not the voice of AA. Bill Wilson is. Dr. Bob is. Let me move past this because AA has a lot of good and it has helped millions of people. And there is so much good to AA. I don't want to bash it overall as a recovery model. All I'm saying here is you cannot argue the fact that it was written by men for men. And psychologically, that can be hard and damaging for women. And here's why. There's a coded messaging there that for women, especially modern midlife woman, it misses the mark because a woman's healing can't possibly look like a man's. Because we're women with a different level of oppression. We come to recovery at the intersection of womaning, wifing, momming, oppressed. You add on women of color, trans women. You add on this intersectionality. And the healing cannot possibly look like a man's. I don't even coach men. I send them straight to another man because the psychology is different. The intersectionality is different. You come to your drinking in different ways as a man. It doesn't mean that I'm a man hater. Men are no less than women. It's just that intersectionally we come to drinking differently, right? And as from my experience as a coach, a woman's drinking is most often not because they're too egotistical or too grandiose. It's more about self-abandonment. I mean, in my experience, women come to me seeking recovery because they are exhausted. They are overfunctioning. They are emotionally silencing, people-pleasing, martyring. One of the lines I've heard so many times, and it's so synchronistic that women keep saying this, it's almost like without each other knowing they're saying this. They'll come from all walks of life saying, it feels like a death by 1,000 cuts being a woman in this culture. And the drinking and the trauma and the abandonment, shame is a death by 1,000 cuts. And so while AA has such good benefits, it gave us a beautiful community and structure. It also handed women a recovery model that was not built for our psychology and our lived reality. And that matters also for today because in recovery and sobriety, to this day, women who choose not to follow the AA path are told they need to mind their egos, get right-sized, and this is the worst one for me, get more spiritual. As if AA holds the monopoly, the key to spirituality, because it was formed by some early Anglo-Protestant man. To this day, I get messages in my DM that, well, you're not spiritual. Your recovery has no spirituality. That's why you're not flourishing in AA. Or, that's your ego talking. To this day, in fact, just today, I got a message about how, you know, you need a truly spiritual journey because addiction is a spiritual malady. As if, because I don't go to AA, I don't get spiritual. That to me is absolutely ludicrous. And you can tell I'm getting worked up here. I'm alone at home with a pyramid of Diet Coke cans, spitting into the microphone, screaming into the ether. Because this type of stuff makes me so passionate. And it's not the fucking DMs. It's not the people who feel entitled to slide into my DMs like they know my life, like they know my history, my trauma, my freaking DNA. It's that this has become sort of a cultural message that AA is the spiritual recovery, and whatever the fuck you're doing out there is not. And that couldn't be any more farther from the truth. I've been in various recovery circles that are both co-ed and not. And it is some of the most spiritually seeking, curious, loving individuals. I digress. So, this area of messaging is hurtful to women because it asserts that AA is the only way. And because it asserts that you are delusional and you are a selfish bitch if you don't, humble yourself to this. And I'm sorry, but I don't know a lot of women. In fact, I know 0 women who have a drinking problem because they have a giant ego. I'm looking at me and my sister for an example. I'm free-spirited. I was a career woman. I never had children of my own. I partied. I did all the things. She was a stay-at-home mom who was devoted to her 3 children, who was married to the same man for 25 years. And you know what we have in common? We came to recovery from drinking too much because we were exhausted, ashamed, burned out, belittled, passed over, ignored. We did not come to recovery from drinking too much because we had huge fucking egos. In fact, I don't know any woman that does. And I'm only using me and my older sister as an example because we've both been sober close to 8 years and we are wildly different women with different paths. For a long time, I thought, well, maybe I'm, just this woman that didn't have children. And so I have a giant ego and I chose to become educated and pursue my career and, my personal travels in my life. No, no, no. Because my sister did all the friggin' right things in a man's book. And she still came to recovery having found herself in a drunken oblivion because we were crushed. Because our ego was crushed. We didn't ever have the feeling of strength and sovereignty. We didn't ever have the feeling that we could trust our own intuition. So humility gets weaponized against women, especially if you don't go to AA. It's like, well, you're not humble enough. Your ego's running the show. And AA is the only group out there that does this. That's the only beef I have with it. And that's the only reason I'm using it as a recovery group example here. Because I ain't been sliding into my DMs by no Dharma recovery people or the Luckiest Club or Smart Recovery or She Recovers. Nobody besides AA people are sliding into my DMs to tell me that I'm doing it wrong. See, all these other recovery groups out there are like, do whatever you want, do you. Now, I'm not saying everybody in AA is like that. I know a lot of amazing people that are in AA that are like, any way you get sober is fine, as long as you stay sober and you're spiritually fit, right? That's the language that they use. But I am saying the majority of the dogma and the criticism and the shaming has come from people in the 12-step world, men especially, and some women. And when this really started to shift for me, and this is wild, I'm going to go way off here. But when I started on my spiritual journey, let me just say, an early monastic teaching, like basically a monk, they were taught, okay, so this goes so far back because they were taught basically how to be a woman. If you go back to monastic traditions, like even like the Desert Fathers, the Benedictine orders, all their contemplative practices, the core teachings are emotional surrender, dying to yourself, silence, fasting, starvation, obedience, community. And when I look at those core teachings for early monastics, I think, well, dude, that sounds like being a woman. So healing for them is not the same as healing for a woman. I mean, society has rewarded these traits in women for centuries. Surrender, starvation, obedience, that service work. Hello, we call that Tuesday. And it made me laugh thinking that a man had to become a monk to access what a woman is already expected to be by default. Even the progressive women of my time, growing up in the 80s and 90s, when women were allowed to vote, my mother was still obedient to my father. She was still starving herself. She was still in service to her community and working as a nurse like a good woman. Okay, I'm gonna take a deep breath here. Women, we're doing monk level emotional work while we are running a household, a job, a body, a relationship. We're keeping 1,000 fucking balls in the air. Of course we drank. Of course we burned out. So, of course, sobriety is a bit of a feminist uprising. The patriarchal system taught women to silence their truth. So, alcohol just picked up the fucking mic for millennia. Women are taught, don't feel too much, don't want too much, don't take up too much space, don't question, don't speak, for God's sake, don't trust yourself. So, what do women do when their instincts scream like, whoa, something's fucking wrong here? But the culture that we're raised in is like, you need to be grateful. What do women do? We numb out. We hustle for our worth. We cope. We overperform. And at the intersection of all the things that bring us to sobriety and recovery are, the ways that we're oppressed because of our race or our religion or neurodivergence. Intersectionally, women come to recovery, some performing their asses off, some hustling their asses off, and we drink. Sobriety becomes feminist because sometimes for women, it's the first time they've allowed themselves to hear their own damn voice, right? And here's what we know. Once you hear your own voice and trust your own knowing, you can't unhear it. In my group container for Rewired Sober, the women's coaching group, I highly emphasize trusting your inner knowing. And you cannot access your inner knowing while you are abandoning yourself. And I'm going to take you into some of the teachings that have been conveyed to me by women like Carolee Flinders, and Megan Watterson, women who are experts in feminism and theology and mysticism, like essentially spirituality. They opened up this concept for me, and it's something that I've always known. It was just the first time anyone had put it into words. And this started for me last year Last year is what I called my spiritual quest. One of my pilgrimages to New York, where I often wander the streets for hours, often into hypothermia, and contemplate life. One of my trips to New York, I got 777 tattooed on my arm. Now, this was like the day of my 7-year anniversary as well. But I did this because this year, this 7th year of sobriety, I knew was going to be a spiritual year for me. Going into it, I was getting very spiritually curious. And as the year moved on, oh my God, I mean, it became my spiritual year. And fast forward, especially during the Trump administration, you know, a misogynistic racist is elected as president, and white Christian nationalism starts being weaponized by the right, further contributing to sexism, racism, homophobia. You can shut the podcast off right now if you don't like that, but that's the friggin' truth of it. When all of this started happening, I started realizing I am highly spiritual and yet moving all the way away from organized religion, from having been raised my entire life, even confirmed as a Catholic and a Christian. I moved away from that. And what I learned to be true was that some of this started for me at a really young age when I read the Bible, and it was really heartbreaking. And it continued into my adult life when my husband and I went to our church to get couples counseling, and we found out that they don't respect and or counsel, coach, or even acknowledge a same-sex marriage. Broken fucking hearted, we left the church because we are not a same-sex couple, but we are a mixed race couple, and we both believe that God's love is unconditional. It doesn't freaking matter how you come to God or Jesus or spirituality. Judging people, shaming people, casting people out. No. We are all equal. We all had love. And so when I started studying the work of especially Megan Watterson and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, her viewpoint is she calls God the good, the love inside all of us. It's a non-gendered entity. And of course, this was considered apocryphal back then. And so that's why Mary Magdalene's, you know, scriptures aren't in the actual Bible today, because the people who canonized, codified the Bible were like, fuck no, we're not putting that in there. That's a woman's messaging, and it alludes to the fact that we are all equal and that we all have access to love and good. And so it didn't make it into the Bible. You know, it asserted that we can all access love inside of us. And so when I started to really dive into that, it confirmed what I already knew, which was if the Bible could disregard a woman's voice, call Mary Magdalene a whore because it was convenient for the male powers that be, for the sake of the hierarchy, for the sake of the patriarchy, then so could the big book of AA, because it was organized by men for men, with women second, women to be subservient. And I felt equally as heartbroken by the Bible as I did the big book of AA, because that's where the book of AA missed the mark for women. And it was something about this last year in doing these odd things in my life that I had no idea were coming to the intersection of my recovery. I was starting to cover my walls with crosses and pictures of powerful women. And some of them were religious in depiction. Some of them looked like the Virgin Mary. Some of them were of Frida Kahlo. Some of them were of random modern women. You know, one of them is the old editor of Harper's Bazaar and Vogue, Diana Vreeland, just strong women in general. And things that felt very spiritual and sovereign, but also highly spoke of a woman's power and a woman's loving voice and the divine feminine. And all of this started to kind of meld together into my recovery. I even got the word divine feminine tattooed on my right bicep, not really fully understanding what that was, just fully knowing that I was that, right? And back to Megan Watterson, who I will forever be a part of her group and teachings because she put into words the difference between knowing in your mind and knowing in your soul and being able to trust your intuition. And that, for me, is one of the biggest feminist issues here that happens when we cut the crap and we get sober. See, Megan Watterson taught me women carry a deep spiritual intuition. Now, the Greek word for knowing is gnosis, which means an inner knowing. It doesn't mean you are intellectually aware. It doesn't mean someone taught you and you got a degree in it, right? So when I talk about neuroscience, that is knowledge that I am passing on from a book. That is that kind of knowing, understanding your mind and your brain. But when I talk about your inner knowing, I'm talking about what Megan Watterson taught me, which is the Greek word gnosis. It lives in the body. It's the soul intelligence. It says, you know, I'm meant to rise. I deserve to breathe. I deserve to take up space. I deserve to feel safe. And I have access to the love because it lives within me, the divine love. And that kind of stuff was never taught to me in a traditional Christian church. And it was certainly never taught to me in AA. In fact, in AA, it's blasphemous to trust yourself. And I understand in AA when our brain is diseased, when we are in active addiction, we're drinking, we're drunk. Yes, you don't trust yourself. You don't go driving and buy a bottle of wine. That is different than trusting your intuition and your deep knowing. I am not saying when you're actively a drunk, you know what's best. So let me just caveat that right now. But I am saying that when you put the alcohol away and when you sit down in recovery circles, and the women who've been sitting with me for months into their recovery, and they start to trust their intuition, I absolutely encourage that and applaud that. I do not say, oh, you don't know what, you can't possibly know. Even in early recovery, you know how to trust your intuition. And early recovery is messy. Your brain is still leveling out, and there is a lot of recalibration that goes on. So that is maybe why you bounce things off of another woman who's been there. That's maybe why you enter a group like mine and Rewired Sober, or you hire a coach, because in the beginning, sobriety is tough and there's a lot of recalibration going on. There's a lot of mixed messages coming at you. But I will always encourage you to trust your intuition. The intuition that alcohol has always muffled. Being sober will amplify that, right? Because sobriety, as we've said, is not about quitting drinking. It's not just about quitting drinking. In so many ways, it's a returning to your own spiritual authority. And that, my friend, is feminism. So, to wrap this up, why is it a feminist act? Because it's the moment a woman stops being manageable and becomes sovereign. It's the moment she says, I will no longer mute myself to, apologize for my power. I will no longer mute my body's truth. I will no longer numb to survive, right? I will no longer abandon myself or outsource my wisdom. Sobriety is a feminist thing because it restores our voice and our agency our intuition, our boundaries, our safety, our identity, right? It gives a woman back to herself. So at Rewired Sober, I'm not teaching women to fit themselves into an old mold. I'm teaching brain science that explains why you drank, why you kept coming back to it, and then the gnosis, the soul knowing that helps you trust yourself again. We do nervous system repair, feminist reframes. I'm a big advocate for emotional literacy and identity reclamation, self-trust, right? It's a resurrection. So how do we move in that direction? What I like to say is we reclaim a power. We're not surrendering to it. You don't heal by abandoning yourself. You heal by becoming the safest person that you know. And recovery becomes a stronger force, not weaker, when you start to trust your inner voice. And we anchor our healing in the mind knowing of neuroplasticity, that our brain is not broken. It has maladaptive wiring to a pattern that we've taught ourselves, and we can change that. We can rewire that path. What you lived can be rewired through pattern interrupt, emotional regulation, connection, repetition. And we start to embrace that soul work because the patriarchy feared that the patriarchy's always feared that we would embrace the work of our soul, that we would build discernment and uncover our inner authority. The patriarchy's always feared that women would learn to trust themselves. When you remother yourself, your younger self, you reconnect with the divine feminine. Even the parts the patriarchy said are too much, too loud, right? That's how we do it. And so I'm going to end this, but thank you so much for hanging out with me today and for being brave enough to listen to this in full and to question the systems that shaped us. And you know that you are not too much, defective, you're not an alcoholic, you're not forever doomed, too loud, too emotional, too intuitive, whatever. You're just a woman learning how to live outside the stories that men wrote for you. So if this episode lights a fire under you, share it with a friend. Leave a review, jump into my DMs and say something positive. And certainly click on any of the links. You can learn how I help women rewire their brain and reclaim their power. This is not a time to shrink. This is a time to remember who the hell we are. So I will catch you next time. Thanks for tuning in to Rewired Sober. You can find me on my Instagram at Rewired Sober, where there are links to catch up with me and all the things I'm working on in my coaching business, or the link tree to my business directly will be in the show notes. I so appreciate you joining me on this journey, and I welcome any feedback or any topics you want to hear about, things that you're struggling with or interested in. I love you all so very much, and I'm just so enjoying doing this with you.